Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hi, Arnie.
No worries.
Good to see you again.
Pleased to
It's
have
always
you.
pleasant.
Pleased to have you, Robert. Thank you for joining us. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Hello, Arnie. Greetings from Western Canada.
No worries. All right, I'm going to cut across to some websites. And in this case, in this instance, this is the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms. It's a Canadian website, Canadian organisation. And in particular, the chief medical officers are presenting. This is from a question, the lockdown's adverse health impacts. Now, I think that in itself is very important because we don't actually consider what is going on in the sense of how adversely it is affecting other people. And being a medical officer, of course, this person has got first-hand information as to the points to consider. And I think that's actually, we're blindsided to this. We're blindsided out of, I saw it in a French report, a demonstrator. I think it was the fear of death is causing us to lose this life. The fear of
Mhm.
death is causing us to lose this life. Something similar to that. He was wearing a placard, being arrested. And I think that's very, very important. This fear of death. It's overbearing. Your thoughts, Wallace Clink?
Well, that is quite true, Arnie. Now, we are discussing social credit and the benefits that would flow from it, and in terms of association, increments of association,
Hmm.
which evolve to the advantage of individuals who associate at different levels in different ways. And we want to maximize that for human beings.
Hmm.
And when we see things like this drastic, draconian lockdown that has been imposed upon the world, or a good part of it, in order to isolate people, you can see that association is being ruptured.
Hmm.
And when that happens, you're not getting any benefits out of it. But you may be getting some serious decrements out of the fact that your association has been interfered with, actually stopped in many cases.
Yeah.
And so I think that it is a very appropriate subject. We want to maximize the quality of life on Earth for human beings.
Hmm.
And this is having a very, very adverse effect.
Yeah.
We have an organization in Calgary called the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms.
Hmm.
And they've just sent a very searching questionnaire to the Prime Minister to find out how much they have considered the possible consequences of what they're doing. And I think that they're really putting the heat on them in
Yeah.
a polite way, but in a way that they won't be able to avoid. If they do avoid it, they're going to be putting themselves in a very embarrassing and vulnerable position.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I
So I
appreciate.
think that
I appreciate where you're coming from, Wallace. I know that in our household, we're experiencing certain levels of lockdown, not of the same um, stringency as the eastern states. We're still in South Australia, still allowed to have 10 people meet together under certain circumstances, and I think that's important. But our household, we're really everything is the same. Nothing has changed, and
mhm,
if it's necessary to visit next door, we do, because we've got neighbours and friends that we keep an eye on. And I think that's very, very important that we're able to do that. Whereas in a nursing home situation or someone who is isolated and ill under eastern state greater stringencies, these people would be suffering and suffering badly. Your thoughts, Robert Klink?
Yes, well, you made the point about fear of death, Arnie, and I think that is a critical issue
Hmm.
because uh, people have been prepared to die for their freedom, but also for the freedom of others.
Hmm.
And they had that willingness because they were, well, there are different religions in the world and they all have different takes on this. I was in Vietnam and I saw a terrible accident that involved the killing of 2 young people, and they didn't take it as utterly calamitous. And I think it's because they believe in reincarnation.
Hmm.
So that gives them a perspective on the continuation of life after this life. But
Hmm.
Christians also have a perspective, and it is Jesus who said that those who believe in him, now I'm not sure exactly what that means,
Mm.
if that means do his will, which is the Father's will. I'm not sure what that means, but that if they did, they would have a promise of eternal life.
Yeah.
So you get a sense that this life is not all there is. Very many people nowadays can't conceive of anything else, and therefore to lose their life is to lose everything.
Yeah.
And Jesus also said that there's no greater love than to lay down your life for your brother.
Yeah.
So these are very important principles, and they have a dramatic effect in changing your behavior,
Hmm.
because it's a liberating thing. If you believe that in acting in this way, you are doing the right thing, and you are furthering the good in creation.
Yeah.
So that's a very important thing. Also, you mentioned the nursing homes. I have a friend who's in a nursing home,
Hmm.
and haven't seen her for about 6 weeks now, I think. It is absolutely miserable,
Yeah.
because the people in those nursing homes live for the visits they get from family and friends.
Hmm.
And when that is cut off, it must be just so totally depressing that I'm sure it's making those people sick. And it's probably resulting in the deaths of a number of them, because they've lost their purpose in living, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. No.
It's a dreadful thing. And I am really disturbed that no effort has been made to allow visits, because you could set up visits and have them conducted in a safe manner. But there doesn't seem to be any thought to that. It just shut these people up in their rooms, and and for how long?
Yeah.
This thing could go on for months and months.
That's right. That's
It,
exactly right. And to me, the what's being taken, not being taken into account, or if it has been taken into account, it's malevolent, and that is the adverse effects on people in isolation. And
Mhm.
and and what do you discount suicides while you count coronavirus, and I think that's just so wrong. It's brutalizing, really. It's house arrest and brutalizing, and this in history. We received an email just yesterday from, no, it wasn't. It was from in the Quadrant magazine, a constitutional theorist, if you like. I think a lawyer, Zimmerman, Augusto Zimmerman, I think his name is, and it was in regard to the history of imposition of emergency situations, emergency scenarios, and totalitarian rule by edict rather than by the Parliament, and by the debates in the Parliament and votes, and two houses plus review royal assent, and all of these things have been put aside to be ruled by edict. And it's not unprecedented. This was going on in 1930s Germany again and again and again in order to bring about that dictatorship. And the thing is that freedom is quite fragile. Freedom can be lost in a heartbeat. It can certainly be lost in a generation. And we've been under attack against freedom for the best part of 100 years in our own constitution. So these things are, to me, are most important for us to consider the ramifications of that. Your thoughts, Wallace Klinck?
Well, it's certainly true, Arnie. I think that in my day, when I was much younger, I think people, although it was a less sophisticated age, I think they were more concerned about freedom,
Hmm.
more aware of it. It's aware of its importance, its nature, and its necessity.
Yeah.
And I do think sometimes today that people are very inclined to yield to totalitarian action
Hmm.
on the basis that it's being done for a good purpose.
Yeah.
Well, the
Yeah.
thing about it is, anyone who knows anything about constitutionalism knows that constitutions are meant to provide a barrier to arbitrary action on the part of governments and anyone who's to do with administration.
Mm-hmm.
They are limited, and it's not optional.
That's
And
right.
it's for a good reason. It's
Yeah.
for the simple reason that crises can be a really big advantage to authoritarian people who
Yeah.
want to impose their will, their policies, and their measures upon other people.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems today that governments are all too often inclined to jump up and say, today we'll pass a bill that may be regarded as an infringement upon the usual rights, civil rights, but this is a crisis and we have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, as this institution in Calgary is pointing out, the measures that they've been taking have not been without consequences. As a matter of fact, they have been with serious consequences, and government appears not to have done certainly much in the way of documenting this for the knowledge of the public.
Yeah.
The consequences of their actions.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's a very dangerous situation, and I mean, we don't know how many of these deaths that do take place, which are not really that. I mean, can't talk about deaths as being inconsequential, but on a comparative basis, the number of deaths has not been comparable to that from the flu.
Yeah.
Now, how many of these deaths are actually due to the virus itself?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's very easy for them to just record the deaths as a statistic and say that they died from the virus.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
now, we don't. And I mean, the thing of it is, the virus might be a contributing factor, but it might not even be the actual determining factor.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I see where we're going on this whole thing, Wallace, as being political. I declared it through the journals and through this forum at least 6-8 weeks ago that it was political. It had nothing to do with the threat of a virus, because in the historical precedents, if people are infectious, then it's those that are infectious who are identified and they are secured. And if that's in their own home or in a hospital, whatever, they're secured. You don't secure the whole population. You don't put the whole population under house arrest. So this was in the history of things unprecedented, certainly for medical reasons, but it was for political reasons, and that's what this is about. They don't care. The people that are imposing this situation on the world don't care that these aged and infirmed and isolated and lonely people die. Let's be clear about that. They don't care. They are collateral damage. This is for a political purpose. And the political purpose is one of power. It's one of setting aside constitutions and one of rule by, if you like, proclamation. Rule by proclamation. The same sort of rule by proclamation that a king would have done. And of course, the king, as the tyrant, was pulled back into line because of situations like Magna Carta. That argument went for 200 years. But the fact is that they were pulled back into line. And here we've got the executive, if you like, not even Parliament, but the executive, through edicts, through proclamations, are determining that this is what's going on today, and tomorrow it may be completely different. And this is about power. This is not about coronavirus, and if you like, it's an attempt to seize power for world government. Your thoughts, Robert Klinck?
If you look at the leaders of many of our societies, they are so inclined to want to employ dictatorial methods. We have a prime example of that in Canada in the form of Justin Trudeau. I mean, he's just issued another edict. He has decided, without consulting the population in any way, that they're going to make a broad category of guns illegal. in Canada. Now,
Mhm.
they admit that these guns are out in the population in the tens and tens of thousands, and they're uh, used safely by 99.999% of the owners.
Mhm.
But this fellow has just decided, he's made a declaration on his own, no discussion in Parliament, that
Mhm.
this will be a change.
Mhm.
So they're operating through the regulation system. And this, I suppose, could be justified, but it's certainly not justified for one man to come up with, as you say, an edict,
Mhm.
Arnie,
Mhm.
that a new policy is going to be introduced. And again, is he thinking of the ramifications of this policy? No, he's a total ideologue,
Mm.
and he sees everything through the lens of his conditioning. He's a kind of an automatonic person. I don't know where he comes from. He's a
Mm.
very strange fellow, but he loves to dictate,
Yeah.
and this is a total departure from his proper function,
Yeah.
which is to be the leader of a government and to develop policy on the basis of consultation and realistic analysis.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
he's in the abstract world and totally uh, uh, disdainful of the opinions of the population as a whole.
Yeah.
And that, that's why they are able to pursue this uh, prosecution of the policies regarding this alleged pandemic so rigorously. In many respects, all that's being done is harassment. There are many things that could not be justified on any rational grounds.
Yeah.
The police are shutting down bike paths. And I went down to the marina here in my town of Aylmer. The police have gone and put police tape up and down the berths. I mean, they used hundreds of feet of police tape to prevent people from putting their boats in the water. Well, I don't see how it could be a threat to spreading the virus going for a ride on the river. But it's almost malicious, as you say, Arnie, and it seems to be inspired by some puritanical desire to make everybody miserable and make them uncomfortable about doing perfectly natural and harmless activities.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No,
it's
valid point, Robert. We've got the same. We've got the same in Australia, and it's interesting because the across Easter there was a cartoon depiction of the stone being rolled away from the tomb and Christ coming out of the tomb, and there's a Victorian police car and pointing with a bright red nose and a mask on, the surgical mask. Don't even think about it. Don't even
getting out
think
of the tomb.
don't even think about rising from the dead and coming out of the tomb. And to me,
Mm.
that's a reflection of this, if you like, totalitarian philosophy. The police, as I understand it over there, are loving it. They love the power that's gone to it, and of course they're selected, they're psychologically profiled to bring about the government in that state is a Bolshevik government. They openly admit they are a revolutionary Bolshevik government, and they just by edict, the premier is loving it. The police are enjoying imposing martial law on the population. It's also so very very wrong, and it's catering, if you like, to human weakness. The weakness of thinking that given the power, you as the individual can sort this mess out, and of course you can't. You can't. Your thoughts, Wallace Clink? It looks like Wallace has dropped out, unfortunately. So I'm just going to cut back to a two-shot, Robert. Um, okay, so we're looking at the situation with government edict. We're looking at the situation of the people who are isolated and if you like, missing out on a lot of in interaction and engagement with the community that would actually maintain their, if you like, their equilibrium. I know that in my younger days, I was living on a farm. I was in isolation And I used to work 2 weeks and then I'd be at home for 2 weeks on the farm, and it was difficult. It was quite difficult for me, and I suffered from a thing called cabin fever, and it's certainly not unprecedented. It's quite common amongst people who are in isolation. They suffer from it, and it comes on you very quickly. You don't recognise it, but it's you actually need to engage with others in order to maintain your equilibrium. So, on that basis, I was pleased to leave that isolation and get back out into the community, and it was really like a monkey off my back. So I've experienced it firsthand, and as I said, I wasn't an old bloke. I wasn't infirmed. I wasn't locked in a nursing home or something like that. And I looked forward to my one visit every week or two from someone. It was here I was. I could get up. I could jump in the car. I could go and do whatever, but I was still suffering in that environment. So interaction is so important. It's absolutely vital if we're going to maintain an equilibrium within ourselves, the balance. And so I think that to me is quite important to take these things into account. Now I noted that I believe we've got Wallace back. Are you there, Wallace?
Yes, I'm here.
No worries. You dropped out for a second there, but you're back. So we're talking about the adverse effects of on individuals and the fact that the tyrant is quite happy to impose their point of view. In the previous case, it was talking about your Prime Minister, who was prepared to impose their point of view on the population because they seem to know best. Now, I don't believe that it's unintentional. I believe that there is a deliberate a deliberate ploy in this whole thing. The justification is the COVID-19. That's the justification. But in reality, the attempt is a power grab. It's political in nature. And your Prime Minister is no different than our Prime Minister or our, if you like, our Premier of the Bolshevik states around us. It's a seize for power, and they want this power over and above. And of course, it's the same flaw that King John had when he was forced to put his seal on the Magna Carta. Your thoughts, Wallace Klinck?
Well, they got fed up with King John, and they literally told him that if he didn't stop taxing without representation, that they were going to behead him.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the Magna Carta was an outcome of that particular confrontation, and then it was actually modified a bit several years later. But the National Post is one of our major papers here,
Mm-hmm.
and it ran an article by John Carpe, who is the head of this Justice Center,
Mm-hmm.
and called Alberta's Bill 10 is an affront to the rule of law. Now, you see, this, as far as I can see, they are trying to be very non-party in their approach.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to be principled. And anyway, this is on April 14th, and the legislation rushed through the legislature in less than 48 hours.
Mm.
Gave cabinet ministers new power to write de facto laws and create new penalties without the approval of the Legislative Assembly.
Mm.
Can you believe it?
Mm.
Now, Alberta government had quietly expanded its own powers previously under Public Act Bill 10, which was rushed through the legislature in less than 48 hours, gives cabinet ministers new powers to write de facto laws, create new penalties without the approval of the legislature. Now, they're empowered to bureaucrats to take property away from citizens and organizations, force citizens to render aid, conscript people to deal with an emergency, and to enter into any building or property without a warrant.
Wow.
Now, this is just absolute tyranny.
Yeah.
And the chief medical officer was already empowered to forcibly quarantine any person who's ill or caring for a sick person.
Yeah.
And they also are empowered to suspend operation of provincial laws in whole or in part once cabinet declares a public health emergency.
Yeah.
But now cabinet ministers have acquired the additional power of creating and implementing new orders and penalties simply through ministerial order. without them being discussed, scrutinized, debated, or approved by the Legislative Assembly.
Mm-hmm.
Now listen to this. It's increased the maximum penalty for disobeying the Public Health Act from $2,000 to $100,000 for a first offense, and from $5,000 to $500,000 for a subsequent offense.
Wow. Wow.
Can you believe this?
That's such a totalitarian perspective, arbitrary decision, and of course in these decisions like this, how would you interpret that? If an officer determines that you've done something and you're attempting to abide by what's going on, and yet somewhere along the line there's a miscommunication, and all of a sudden you've got this 100,000 threat, or if it's a repeat 500,000 threat over your head, and based on what? What is the actual threat? It's not a threat, it's actually one of power. It's one where you could lose your home. You lose your home simply by failing to abide by a direction. And that's got nothing to do with medical safety. That's got to do with totalitarianism. This is a power grab. That's what it is. And this Constitutional Justice Centre, Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedom, is doing a huge service for the community. And I'll certainly be placing the links to this website below this video so that you can actually chase it up yourself. Because yes, we are watching our constitutions being deconstructed in front of us, and the if you like, the opposition, and it's true because this is in Australia, it's Conservative government that's doing this. The opposition are Bolshevik, they're socialists. They're not saying anything because this is their policy. The Conservatives are implementing a socialist or communist or Bolshevik policy over the people, and nothing's going on. There is no noise because they agree. They agree with these constitution disassembly, the dissection, the destruction of our ancient freedoms right in front of us, and no one's talking about it. Certainly not the news cycle. There's no talk of it. The first I heard of it, and I'll see if I can find it while I'm off camera, is from a constitutional person. I'll see if I can find his article because it is interesting. Your thoughts, Robert Klinck?
Well, fines of those dimensions are simply state terrorism. There's no justification for imposing such fines except to instill a fear, a paralyzing fear in the population. They'll be afraid to open their mouths about anything because they might fall on the wrong side of these regulations and get into terrible trouble. So what we're dealing with here is just the Bolshevik policy of instilling fear on the one hand and guilt on the other. And they've got us going both ways with this pandemic thing. You've got the fear of becoming deadly ill, I guess. That's one thing, and it's certainly affected the behavior of a large percentage of the population. But they also have this guilt thing going because they have everybody feeling that they have to be careful not to infect anybody else. So they've got this social distancing, which is becoming more and more strictly enforced. They keep holding out the hope that this is going to be relaxed. It'll be relaxed a bit, but we're living in a new world, and they're not going to back down from a lot of the changes that they've introduced into it. You know, the social distancing in Canada, recommended by Health Canada, which is the Ministry of Health in Canada, about, 7 months ago, was that you should stay at least a meter away from other people to avoid contaminating them. And all of a sudden, it was 2 meters, and then it was 2 yards. And now they're saying, if you can believe it, stay the distance of a hockey stick. Because Canadians all, I guess, understand basically what the length of a hockey stick is. Well, a hockey stick is about a meter and a half long. So they're
Mm-hmm.
changing their recommendations all the time, and putting everybody ill at ease and uncomfortable with what they're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be doing,
Yeah.
and it's guilt and uh, throwing people off balance
Yeah.
constantly.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's a psychological game. There's no doubt of it.
Absolutely. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned the hockey stick, because the hockey stick graph was something that, of course, was presented to the world as a reflection of what the climate was doing. And of course, the cases in North America, the court cases over the data, the raw data that where this person came up with a hockey stick, the person refused to reveal it so that it could be scrutinised. And of course, the person was called a fraud and said that I think in the discussions that he should be in jail because of his fraud. This is the scientist should be in jail because of the fraud. Now, what we've found also recently, I'll just throw it on the table without cutting across to it, is that the person who's responsible for the recommendations in Britain, the scientific modelling that's gone on with this coronavirus in Britain, uh, is also falling into this same category of unreliable data. Unreliable data. So we're looking at graphs and charts, and these things are unreliable. Now, I'm going to cut across to Quadrant, and this is the actual journal here, Quadrant Online, State Power Control and COVID-19. Augusto Zimmermann talking about it, and he's talking about 1930s Germany. He's talking about 1930s Germany, so that's really is important to go to Quadrant and have a look at that article and read it, because Augusto Zimmermann has recently produced 3 booklets. They're sort of more booklets than books on Australia's constitution and history. I don't follow his theme. I don't necessarily agree with his theme, but what he does do is reasonable authority, and I think that on the basis of that, you've got to accept that okay, he's the professor, he's the expert. I may disagree, but at least I'll give him a floor, an opportunity to speak his piece. And in this case, he is comparing what's going on in Australia to Nazi Germany and the dictatorial powers of the regime of that time. And it's no different. We've got to seriously shake ourselves up on this. This is not a funny situation. And the frustrating point about it is that in Australia, the medical, it looks like the outcome of this is going to be some sort of medical monopoly by the government, and also, of course, the imposition of the welfare state. 1.5 more million people have gone to the government, cap in hand, in need of support, and because of this government policy. Don't tell me this is not deliberate. Don't tell me this is not benevolent. This is deliberate, and this is by a conservative government imposing Bolshevik policy on Australia. So, as the alternative, as Jeffrey Dobbs points out, when you see the Conservatives imposing totalitarian socialism on you, what is the only other option? It's a full-blown communist government. This is the only thing that Labor is to offer. In Canada, you call them liberal. Liberal. Well, I try and identify the difference. In Australia, it's called Labor, but they're basically Bolshevik governments. So we've got the Conservatives imposing Bolshevik policy, and the option in an election is to choose a full-blown Bolshevik government. It's a no-win situation. It is quite deliberate, and it's to deconstruct our constitution. We're at the 33, 34-minute mark. I'm going to call for summary and closing comments. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, there's no doubt about it. Even in Alberta, we're supposed to have a conservative government,
Mm-hmm.
and they are passing this draconian, arbitrary legislation.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem to make too much difference what government you have in office.
Mm-hmm.
They are responding to pressure. Now, whether they're directly complicit or just responding because they are not very well educated or because they're cowardly or even treasonous, I don't know. It probably varies. But
Mm-hmm.
it's a very, very serious situation, and it can have the most profound consequences for the quality of our future life.
Yeah.
And we simply have to bring an end to this business. Politicians, like all experts, they're not experts, they're servants are put there to serve. That is their primary responsibility. They're not there to dictate.
Mm-hmm.
They're there to serve the community.
Mm-hmm.
And in other words, it's the old saying, experts were meant to be on tap, not on top. And they have to be given to understand that very clearly. In the consumer market, of course, you can directly, as an individual, you can control that by saying, I don't like your product and I'm not supporting it.
Mm-hmm.
But when the government starts doing arbitrary things, you've got a problem. What do you do?
Yeah.
You're going to have to resort to the courts. And if the courts are not helpful, you have a revolutionary and potentially violent situation. So it's a very serious situation. And it's a tragedy that at this stage of history, after the things we've gone through, that people will put up with this kind of thing. They are so easily persuaded that the government has a responsibility to look after us. And no matter what, that responsibility allows them to do anything practically in carrying out their alleged responsibilities.
Yeah.
Well, you can see where this is all going. It's just a disaster path.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Wallace. That's certainly a very good summary of where we're heading. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, I think we have an erroneous concept of how pressure is applied to the people who are in positions of utmost power in our society. That includes corporations, it includes politicians, it includes probably high church officials. The Jeffrey Epstein scandal in the United States revealed that thousands of underage girls were brought into a situation where they could be made available to all kinds of people, hundreds and hundreds of people of influence, and they were subject to blackmail for their sexual involvement with underage girls. In this case, there's been cases where boys have been involved as well. In this case, it was a girl thing. But these people are not free agents.
Yeah.
They have a blackmail threat hanging over them at all times. So we elect people to Parliament, and we assume that they're going to act well, to a degree in their own interests, but also possibly in our interests. But if they're not free because they are tangled up in these control mechanisms, then they're not going to respond to the population. And you wonder why, when they get into power, are they so subject to not listening to their constituents. Yeah. Well, it's because the pressure is coming from elsewhere, and it is more potent than anything that constituents are bringing to bear on them. I think if constituents still had a concept of the nature of our alleged democracies and our institutions, then this could be overcome to a great extent. But unfortunately, those ideas have not been instilled in recent generations, and therefore they don't have an idea. There was a time when the idea that freedom requires constant vigilance was widespread in society, and people realized that they couldn't just let things go along and they'd be all right, because there's the tendency for power to corrupt and for psychopathic personalities to want to get into positions where they can boss other people around. So we've lost the notion of the principles that have to keep our societies in their institutions on an even keel and to prevent them from being corrupted. So we're living now in a time of extreme corruption because we haven't attended to these matters in recent decades. We've got to clarify this and get back to a saner approach.
Yeah, no, well summarized, Robert. And I've read many times where the politicians in certain nations, they don't actually ever get to the stage of endorsement from the political machine until such time as they are compromised and they're controllable. And so the machines themselves. So it really comes down to, yes, if you're going to vote for a party, then that's the first mistake. Because on that basis, the candidates themselves, the party system is all about controlling the candidate, all about it. And so your representation, your potential for representation, is compromised from the very start. Party systems don't work. They were there to subvert the parliamentary system. The fact is that in Australia, the 1940s, 1930s, 1940s establishment of political parties was the undoing. And then, of course, discussions went from the parliament into the party rooms. And then from the party rooms, they've now gone into the executive. And of course, we're looking at the outcome of that in today. We're looking at it. The executive is making these decisions, arbitrary decisions, and they're being imposed on us. Now, it was William Cobbett. I'll just touch on this because how important it was. William Cobbett, he was elected to Parliament, and what he made it his business was recording every single word that was spoken in Parliament, and he did that for years and years and it was printed, and until such time as he couldn't hold it together any longer, and the printing company was passed over to another person, and the name of that person was Hansard. The name of that person was Hansard, and that became an institutionalised fact that everything that was spoken in Parliament was recorded in Hansard. And now what we need exactly the same standard of being recorded in the party rooms that's open to scrutiny, and also the executive that's open to scrutiny, so that these people are accountable on a minute by minute basis. I'm not talking about national security, I'm talking about general decisions like this. They need to be available for scrutiny so that these discussions are reviewed. The downside to all of this is that the individual voter, put your hand up, this is me, I'm the individual voter. I've chosen to abdicate my responsibility and hand it over to someone else. I've chosen to hand it over to the party machine, to the government. And in this case, 1.5 million more Australians are putting their hand up and saying, well, this is all too hard. I'm going to go to the government. And of course, when you do that, then you're actually giving up a little bit of your own autonomy, your own freedom. And this thing called freedom, it comes at a great price. We've recently celebrated Anzac Day. The great price were 100,000 Australians. 100,000 Australians saw that price as being worth paying, and that was with their own lives. And here we are. We go under a bit of hardship, and we put our hands up in the air and say, "Uncle." There is such an opportunity for personal development. It's not funny. The younger generation, they are given no future whatsoever with the deindustrialization of the West and with this inordinate debt that's being imposed on everyone. There is no future. This Bolshevizing is no future for you whatsoever. And the fact is, the Bolsheviks are blaming the elderly. They're blaming this COVID-19 on the elderly, causing a generational conflict, if you like, the dialectic between the young and the old. And it's nothing of the sort. It's revolutionary. It's Bolshevism. It's communism. And it's being imposed by conservative governments. So we've got to really rethink this thing and go back to square one. And it's not something that's just putting a tick in the box. That won't cut the mustard. It's too important. We've got to take up our own burdens now and do the very things that are set before us for this generation. Thank you so much, Wallace and Robert Klinck, for today's forum.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Arnis.
Bye-bye.